The title of my sermon today is In Times Like These, What Anchors Us? And you can hear that with or without a question mark, as you wish. But the answer I'm going for, you might guess, is the 7 principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association. But first, I want to talk about times like these. I don't know about y'all, and I am sure it is different for every person in this room, but this has been kind of a wild few months. I know I'm kind of in the middle of things, and I'm new here, and I'm being the sabbatical minister, which is a new thing for me. Being a minister is a relatively new thing for me. But then there's all this other stuff going on in our world, and if you don't know what I mean, or you don't have any sense, you could very easily. You could just start looking at the New York Times headlines, maybe once or twice a week, and you would get a sense of there's just lots of stuff. First of all, we're in a presidential election year, and those years, I have to admit, all my life have made me want to run and hide. I just have very little patience for I was going to say months, but it's really more like years of posturing and debating that isn't really debating, and people positioning themselves and playing games that I really don't quite understand, and I kind of suspect that I ought to understand, but I really think I would be less happy if I understood. So there's that whole election thing. This election feels really different from other ones to me. Just the general lack of civility. Now, I've not perceived prior elections to be very civil either, but this one has reached new heights or depths, as it were. What? Lows. Yeah, there's lows, but then we also get these great lines, like when they go low, we go high. That one's wearing really well. They're using that and using it, reusing it. I like that. But to a lot of extent, nobody's looking quite their best these days in terms of the election. And I'm sad about that because I want to be happy about the prospect of the first real prospect of a woman president of the United States of America. I'm an old feminist from decades back, and this is really exciting. I want to be happy about that. I want to be grateful for what I think is the successful completion of the first African American presidency. But there's so many old wounds being opened and poked at these days, so many traumas being revisited, and that's both with the main players on the stage, but also I'm finding they're having repercussions in the general population. And lots of people are kind of going, oh, and this hurts, and this reminds me of old hurts that I have. And that may open up areas for healing, opportunities for healing, because healing does come from attending to things that have been repressed and ignored and put aside for too long, things that have been neglected. So there is hope. There is just some of the things that are bubbling up again. There's racial, I'm not sure what to call it. I don't want to call it unrest, although some people live in places where that's what it feels like. But I'm also aware that racial unrest really isn't anything new, except maybe our awareness of it is. Again, those headlines, and it's not even, we don't even have to wait for the early morning headlines from the New York Times. We get email notifications, we get Google notifications, we get ticker tapes across any screen we've got on at the moment. Well, they're not ticker tapes. They're called something. Anyway. Crawl, thank you. And so we're getting news all the time, and some of it is about the wounds related to racial problems in our country, and those are old, they are basic, they are foundational to who we are as a people. And maybe they're especially raw because it's an election year, I don't know. So maybe we're in a time of racial sensitization. I think that is true. I think more of us are aware of more things and coming to terms with how we can be voices for change and also be accountable and responsible. There's a yearning. I don't know, maybe not we all, but many of us have dreams for something better. And those, again, none of this is new. These have been with us for decades. There's maybe an opening for a different kind of hope. It may be that things have gotten so uncivil and so violent and so problematic that maybe change will really take hold and stick this time. Maybe there will be real moves of repentance and reconciliation made. I'm there, and this is happening at lots of levels. That I think that the FBI just decided they're going to start studying police use of force, just routine police, city police departments and their routine procedures, how they're using force, when they're using force. And I was kind of like, you mean we haven't been collecting that data? But apparently somebody's going to collect it and pay attention in a new way. The board of the UUA last week made some decisions, I have heard sort of through the grapevine. I haven't been able to find any official announcements yet, but the board has been making significant decisions about how the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations will support the work of black activists within our denomination, so Black Lives of UU, that organization. And I'm sure we'll all be hearing more about that. More things bubbling up, our awareness of and our yearning for something different around issues of power and gender and sexuality. Again, these are not new things, but things have been poking at us, and old traumas are being opened up, and people are saying this is not okay. And I get into conversations with my husband, for example, sometimes where I just kind of want to weep because he's like going, oh, women have been living with this all along. I was like, yes. And yes, it has changed. And yes, the men who are in their 20s and 30s now are different. In some ways, they've grown up in a different world with different expectations. But we are in no sense post-feminist yet. And people are, I don't know, maybe there's, we're coming around to another chance to change things again, or to continue changing. Climate change is not new. The conversation about it is not new, but we're newly aware of it sometimes, that some of the disasters seem to be getting closer together and more disastrous. It now, pretty much most people are aware that climate change is real, and that it appears to be having devastatingly real consequences. And perhaps this is a chance for us to wake up and correct course. And then there's just the always present violence in human life and human society. That doesn't take a break. People who have power and strength and force using it is just something that goes on, and it doesn't take a break in other places in the world when we have something exciting to focus on here in the United States. And as always, life is good still for some of us. It's fine, just fine for many people. And it's also not okay for many people. And that's on a societal level and also on a personal level, just a very personal level. In our lives, we have issues about jobs, money, health, family members. In my life, just this week, we made the transition to having all adolescent children. My daughter turned 13. My son is 17. He's a senior in high school, and we're doing the college thing. It's like, oh yeah, when is that FAFSA due? I better get on that. And there's concern for what kind of world we're sending them out into. So when I say in these times, that's what I mean. What these times feel like to you may be a totally different configuration of things. I don't know whether we're more aware of trouble right now than we've been before. I don't know. I was trained as a historian, so I sort of have a feeling that lots of people have always felt like these times are especially bad, whichever times they happen to be standing in it. I think, however, we are differently aware of those, of the times we live in because of the way communications work. But there is also nothing new under the sun. And I thought of that, and that took me back to where that saying came from. It's from the Hebrew Scriptures. It's actually a very odd Hebrew Scripture. People have trouble kind of trying to figure out, well, what does it mean, and why is this in the Bible? But it's the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's a very ancient text, but nobody really is sure where it's from. It said it was written, the Hebrew tradition has said that it comes from King Solomon, but it's probably not that old. If it were from Solomon, it would be 3,000 years old, but it's more likely 2 or 2.5 million years old, or 1,000 years old. Yeah, millennia is 8,000. But here's the text. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hurries to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Round and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, they continue to flow. All things are wearisome, more than one can express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. The people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them. So, you might find that depressing. or perhaps also it's reassuring. I tend to find it kind of reassuring because we're still here. The life does keep going on. The wind keeps blowing, the streams keep flowing, we keep living and having our babies and living our lives and doing our politics and doing our church and dying, and more people come along after us. And in the words of somewhat more contemporary poets, obladi, oblada, life goes on. So, in the middle of all this, nothing new. In the middle of all this, nothing will be remembered. How do we keep our feet under us? What anchors us? And I would like to suggest to you that being Unitarian Universalism is one of those anchors. For me, it certainly has been. I suspect because you're here this Sunday that has been the case for you, or might be the case for you. And I found this week I think it's wonderful, and when we do talk back, you can tell me what you thought. The UUA Program and Strategy Outreach Office, I didn't even know it existed, has created a new video, which I found on another church's website.
We are Unitarian Universalists. We are people of many paths who are brave, curious, and compassionate thinkers and doers. Every day, people are inundated with information, overwhelmed by demands, and pulled by a culture that seeks to divide us from the web of life. Unitarian Universalism reconnects, bringing people together with meaning and inspiration. We are a house without walls, a congregation without spiritual limits, and a movement that calls you to put more faith in yourself, your community, and your beliefs. We are a faith that honors your mind, your heart, your journey. Simply put, we are a guided path towards a better you and a better world. Grounded in hundreds of years of thoughtful, religious communities, we are people of many generations, ethnicities, genders and sexualities, and spiritual backgrounds. People engaged in making the world a better place. People focusing on what really matters: love, justice, integrity, and hope. Unitarian Universalists have different beliefs, but shared values. We are Unitarian Universalists, and at the same time, we may also be agnostic, Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, humanist, Jewish, Muslim, pagan, atheist, believers in God, and those who let the great mystery be. The diversity of beliefs you'll find in a Unitarian Universalist community is one of our strengths. We're always learning how to see the world from a different perspective. What unites us are our core principles that uphold 7 real-world values: believing in the worthiness of every person, showing compassion and fairness, accepting others for who they are, growing through a personal search for truth, leading with democratic spirit, working for justice, and understanding that everything is interconnected. 7 days a week, Unitarian Universalists live these principles by doing. When we gather, we worship, reflect, and remind ourselves what matters most in life. Whatever our age, we learn to live with more wisdom, more awareness, more gratitude, and more soul. We show our values by showing up to answer the call for social justice. We have a track record of standing on the side of love for civil rights, LGBTQ equality, immigration reform, environmental sustainability, reproductive justice, racial justice, and more. Find what it means to live your deepest values out loud. Join us on this extraordinary adventure of faith.
That was very nice.
Isn't that cool?
Doesn't it make us
I'd like to get a
proud?
copy of that.
It's on the UUA.org front page right now,
Okay.
because it's fairly new. Yeah, UUA.org. I kind of liked it. I like the colors and the graphics, and they're simple, but they're evocative, and yeah, good stuff. So, and I also have the transcript of that if anybody wants to see it more. So, I like that this is a nice little summary of who we are. And I don't know if you noticed, but the 7 principles were in there. Did y'all notice? They kind of went by fast. And they're a little bit reworded. But I want to pull that out because I would like to suggest that the Unitarian Universalism can be an anchor for us. But as Unitarian Universalists, I think our 7 principles, our statement of 7 principles, anchors is one of our primary anchors. It is not the most important to everybody. Different people relate differently to them. But I do think they're a good place to start when you're explaining to people who we are. And I also think they're a really useful tool for life, for me individually and for life in community with each other and for life, our congregation relating to other congregations. Something that I just always find kind of amazing is that these principles are actually bylaws. And I'm shuffling through my papers because I brought you. This is one page of many pages of the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. Okay? The 7 principles. And actually, as best I could tell, as of yesterday, on the UUA website, the only place you can actually see the principles in the format that is on the poster that we had pulled out a couple of weeks ago when I was here, 3 weeks ago, I think. It has it in this wording, this format, but the only place you can find it in this wording now on the UUA website is in this document, which is pages long, and here's the 7 principles, right here. I just think we're funny people. And and these principles are they're not a committee document, but they are a process of they're a result of a democratic process, but a kind of long drawn out process. In the 1960s, the Unitarians and the Universalists merged. You may or may not know that. But they'd been talking about merging or consolidating. I think consolidation is the preferred term, or it was anyway, because it didn't imply that those 2 separate identities would go away, but that they would be added to each other. But they've been talking about consolidating since at least the 1880s, because they've both become kind of small denominations. Who stood substantially with each other on a lot of social and political and theological ways, although despite their differences. In the 1960s, they did finally decide to consolidate, and there was a real struggle at the time over how to state who we are as a combined, consolidated people. And a lot of the conflict centered on the use of language. And some of it was things like, do we say the heritage or our heritage, the church or our church. It was what a lot of us would call wordsmithing and want to get just behind us and let's get on with life. But it was really important to get the words right. And the merger almost didn't happen because people were that attached to the words. But it did manage. They did manage to come up with words that served everyone. In the 1970s, which is pretty soon actually when I think about who we've been as a people and how we've moved on things since then, there was a desire for updated language. Some of the language that was being used in the original statement, some people felt was outdated, didn't speak to the new contemporary situation. And also people started noticing and commenting on and being worried about blatantly sexist language. And some of that was removed during the 70s. But in the early 1980s, there was a big push led by the UU Women's Federation to remove sexist terminology like man and mankind. We UUs believed, and I think they did use the word belief back then, in the brotherhood of man, in the fatherhood of God. And so some of that language, the feminists and the UU Women's Federation were not happy with, and other people were unhappy as well. But there was a big push to remove that language, and there was, again, at General Assembly, there was a good deal of conflict. And not everybody was happy about this, but one of the UUWF leaders suggested, well, why don't we step back, take a year or two, and go and ask for feedback from the congregations. And apparently some members of the Women's Federation were very upset because this was a very strong, clear justice issue for them, and they wanted the changes now. But the decision was made to take some time, and it was 1985 before the current principles, the statement of principles that we have now, was actually approved and passed by the General Assembly. It was voted on a year before. But in the meantime, there was lots of conversation. People took this back to their congregations, had conversations, sent feedback to UUA staff who went through a lot of it and brought it up for conversation at meetings, at General Assemblies, so that by the time it got to the second vote, and apparently for bylaws changes you have to vote at 2 successive GAs. By the time it got to the second vote, it passed almost unanimously. There was one vote against. And this is General Assembly, all the delegates. So we seem to have a lot of stories about there being votes that are unanimous except for one. We never all agree on everything, but that's okay. We get really close. And even though our bylaws say that we need to reassess these principles and purposes every 15 years, we've been working with this statement of the 7 principles now for 30 years. And I think it has been reassessed. There was some talk a few years ago about maybe changing it. And I wonder when I see a video like this that restates them in rather different language, and I'll give them to you side by side in a minute so you can see that. I wonder if maybe we're headed toward another rewrite. Personally, I kind of like them. That'll probably come through as we talk a little more. But it's interesting to see how we go about doing these things. So, but then we have this statement of who we are, and you know what, I'm giving up. You saw the picture of the pretty wheel. I'll just describe it to you and tell you it. The point I wanted to make with that is that those 7 principles have been, and first, let me show you. They are in the hymnal. I think maybe I pointed this out to you a couple sermons back. But right before the very first hymn, if you go to hymn number 1 and turn back 1 page, you'll be looking at them. They've been, it's a list of 7. And a list of 7 is a nice, straight, linear, logical, rational thing. We all like that. We like documents. We put them in bylaws, and they work as bylaws, and they work as inspirational posters, too. They're rather nicely written. But Chuck isn't here today, but I think last time it was a couple sermons back, I talked about the 7th principle. So we talked a little about the 7 principles, and Chuck said he had, somebody had suggested the image of an arch, where you have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. So the 4th principle is actually the keystone of the arch. And if you know just as much as I know about architecture, which is much. The keystone is actually what holds the arch. All the weight from above comes through the keystone and gets redistributed. Instead, in a straight wall, it would go straight down, but the keystone divides that force from right above the arch down through the other, through the other stones on the side. And so there is space for Unitarian Universalism to exist. And what makes that possible is our free and responsible search for truth and meaning, our fourth principle. And then these others along the side all relate to that, and it's all connected. Pretty much everybody commentators will all say these principles all make most sense in relationship to each other and in the context of each other. I have also heard people talk about these being in pairs. So 1 and 7 work as a pair, and 2 and 6 are a pair, and 3 and 5 are a pair, and then 4 is the center. Again, 4 is the center. I have also seen somebody commenting on them who talks about 1 and 2, this is again sort of an outside-inside thing, 1 and 2 and 6 and 7 as being theological and ethical statements. They are, who we are as Unitarian Universalists. These are statements that are historically established within our traditions and theologically tested. They're statements about human life and how it should be understood and shaped. So we think human life should be shaped by concern for the worth and dignity of the individual, for acceptance and encouragement to spiritual growth, for justice, peace, and liberty. Sorry, acceptance is number 3. I'm getting out of order here. But justice and equity, compassion in human relationships and in society, and respect for the interdependent web. These are our ethical statements of value. And then those center 3 in this model, 3, 4, and 5, are our process principles. They're methodological. They're about how we go about doing these, how we do human life that is guided by justice and compassion and dignity and worth. And we do that by saying, search for truth. The individual searches for truth. And there is the right of individual conscience and also democratic process in our. So that's another. There's also, there's another view that looks at it as sort of starting with the individual and moving through to concern for the everything, the all, the web of existence. And I've seen that done both linearly, so you start with 1 and you end up at 7, but then also I came across this wheel, which I thought was really interesting. That's what I had up here on the graphic before, because that has the worth and dignity of the individual in the center, and the web of life, the web of all existence, not of life actually, existence, is the rim of the wheel, and then everything else is the spokes. I thought, that's kind of interesting. And I don't know which ones work for whom, and here's the picture. You can probably see it almost as well here on this piece of paper. So this is individual, the worth and dignity of the individual. Interdependent web, and there's all the others. So it's just another way to see it. I am not going to run through those 7 principles. If anybody is interested, I know I said I would compare the wording in the video with the old wording. I'm not going to do that right now because I want to go on. But we can do that later if you want, or if anybody wants to see my notes or the transcript from the video. What I really like about all the people having all these different ways of thinking about and organizing the principles is that this is a list. It's an excerpt out of our bylaws that's actually remarkably malleable and flexible. It has staying power. You can do different things with it. And basically, I know lots of people have quibbles with this or that, but mostly we agree. We're people that hardly ever agrees unanimously on anything, right? Mostly these have worked for a really long time. And I think it's partly because you can do different things with it. The language is sufficiently beautiful and sufficiently specific enough, and yet still open enough, that you can do different things with it. And it then becomes a useful guide and even an anchor, I think. What our principles are not is a list of beliefs. And if you've been out in the world saying, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and people say, well, what are you? You probably know that one of the difficulties for some people in understanding who we are is that we can't say, well, this is what we believe. And often if we show people a list of our 7 principles and say, here, this is the best way to understand us, and I really do think that it is the best way, or one of the very best. People go, oh, yeah, well, sure, I agree with all of those, but what do you believe? What book can I read that will tell me who you are? And we're like, there just isn't. In those bylaws, way down there's the principles, and then there's the 6 sources, and then it talks about the purposes of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and then there's a section about inclusion. We're going to try to be inclusive, and we're committed to structuring our lives, congregational and associational, in ways that empower and enhance everyone's participation. Yes, good, good, good. And then we get to the section C-2.4, freedom of belief. Nothing herein shall be deemed to infringe upon the individual freedom of belief which is inherent in the Universalist and Unitarian heritages, or to conflict with any statement of purpose, covenant, or bond of union used by any congregation, unless such is used as a creedal test. So we're not going to be creedal, we're not going to be creedal, we're not going to insist on anything, we're not going to get in the way of you as a congregation or you as an individual saying anything, unless what you're saying gets in the way of somebody else. unless you say this is a creedal test, you have to believe this to be a member of us. Then we're going to say, no, that doesn't fit. So we're not creedal. This is not about statements of belief. That it's just not there. These are more commitments. These are visions for a better world, for a better future, and they're also a program for action, a statement of what we aim for and how we proceed toward the world of which we dream. And this is kind of difficult. One of the commentators I read this week while I was putting the sermon together said, there's nothing, I can't believe in these 7 principles because what they're talking about isn't something that's real yet. Do we really have justice? Do we have perfect justice? Do we really have perfect equity in human relations? Do we have consistently compassion in the world? That's a good question. I don't know. There are too many times and places where we do not. So these are a dream. These are aspirational. They are not descriptions of how reality is, but of how reality can be. They're also not independent statements. These 7 don't work. I think if you were to pick out any one, and we often all will have, different people among us will have different favorites, but really those favorites get unbalanced quickly if you don't hold them in the context of the others. And I like them as a set. And they're also very optimistic. And some people think they're too optimistic and they want to throw some other balancing statements into those. Some people find they have no clear articulation of the reality of evil and error in human life. And that's arguably true. I would like to suggest that the principles find their real power when they're held in a tension between the difficult realities of times like these, whatever times those might be, or whatever way we understand these times. There's this tension between what really is and our deepest hopes for ourselves and for our world. And it's when you can hold both of those and think through and make decisions through the application of the principles that the principles really come into their own and have some power in changing the world, potentially. These 7 principles insist on both individual and collective experience and understanding of human reality. I think a couple of weeks ago I talked about how being pressured academically to choose whether human beings were individuals or whether they were part of a collective, and a professor told me I had to pick one or the other understanding of human nature. I was like, no, it is both. And I find in our principles that we hold both of those. And we say it's not an either or. Human beings are individuals, and that's important, and we belong to a collective. And the principles are not a license, despite the fact that number 4, the free search for meaning, is the keystone. They are not a license to believe anything we want. That 4th principle is about a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And it exists in the center of these other principles, which suggest that if you want to believe that selecting a few classes of human beings to be the overlords of all the others is the best way to have a peaceful world, that you maybe don't fit with us because they're not in line with the rest. That belief does not align with our principles and our values as you use. So there's always this tension between freedom and responsibility, between openness and limits. There are clear and demanding goals by which to discern what is worth our attention and our very best efforts. The Reverend Scott Alexander in one of his sermons says something to the effect of, "We are free and open, but not easy or lazy." Our principles require a lifetime of thoughtful analysis, discernment, and questioning. They also require that we roll up our sleeves and get busy sometimes. And especially that keystone principle is an invitation, or maybe even a requirement, for each of us to search for our own beliefs, to find those beliefs that are capable of holding us within a life of integrity and on the path toward the world of which we dream. And that's the sense in which I find them to be anchors in times like this. It is not easy. Each of these 7 principles holds some tension and challenge for us. But those tensions and those challenges also point to how they relate directly and practically to real life, to the lived realities of human life. And in that way, I do find them to be anchors, as well as, I'm going to use the word binding, which sounds like the opposite of freedom, except the word religion actually comes from the word the meaning is to bind. And a binding can be helpful in holding you to your path, to your principles. It does not have to be the opposite of freedom. And so, I'm gonna stop because we're ready for coffee, I think. But I would like to challenge you to think about these principles and to think about, do they help anchor you as a Unitarian Universalist, or simply as a human being living in times like these? And I'd like to hear from you, if you're inclined to share later on, whether you find these principles useful in your life, and if so, how. Do you ever think of them outside of church? I do, but then I'm a minister, so I'm thinking about you things a lot of the times when I'm not actually in church. If you do, when? What kind of circumstances bring those up for you? And then, if you're interested, what do you think about this particular list of 7? It's a very particularly historically located list, and it could be otherwise. Do you think there are things that we need to add or subtract to this list? Just topics we could talk about someday, because we're UUs and we like to talk. And I think it's good that we have this list. It's good that it doesn't tell us what to believe, but it doesn't let us off the hook either. It's not that we don't believe anything, and it's not that we can believe anything at all that we choose. And I want to close with a reading you may be familiar with, because it's in our hymnal. But it's from Sophia Lyon-Fahs, who was a Unitarian religious educator of the 20th century. She's all directors of religious education just really love her. But this is one of her best, I think. And it's entitled, "It Matters What We Believe." Some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feeling of being especially privileged. Other beliefs are expansive and lead the way into wider and deeper sympathies. Some beliefs are like shadows clouding children's days with fears of unknown calamities. Other beliefs are like sunshine, blessing children with the warmth of happiness. Some beliefs are divisive, separating the saved from the unsaved, friends from enemies. Other beliefs are bonds in a world community where sincere differences beautify the pattern. Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own direction. Other beliefs are like gateways, opening wide vistas for exploration. Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness. Other beliefs nurture self-confidence and enrich the feeling of personal worth. Some beliefs are rigid, like the body of death, impotent in a changing world. Other beliefs are pliable, like the young sapling, ever growing with the upward thrust of life. May you find the beliefs you need to grow. Blessed be.